The cathedral bells chimed 11 times, each note echoing through Hallie Thornfield's chest, like a countdown to her execution. She stood at the back of St. Matthew's Cathedral, her fingers trembling as they gripped a bouquet of white lilies, flowers that felt more appropriate for a funeral than a wedding. "You look beautiful, dear," whispered Mrs. Patterson, the church coordinator, adjusting Hallie's veil with practiced efficiency. Nervous brides always have the most radiant glow. Radiant. If only she knew that the flush in Hallie's cheeks came from barely controlled panic, not bridal joy. The organ began the processional march, and Hallie's feet moved forward of their own accord, each step carrying her deeper into a nightmare dressed as a fairy tale. The cathedral was filled with Pittsburgh's medical and social elite, people she'd once belonged among, back when the Thornfield name meant something more than mounting hospital bills and desperate bargains. At the altar stood Dr. Henry Colton, 28 years old, devastatingly handsome, and wearing an expression that suggested he'd rather be performing emergency surgery than standing here. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his expensive tuxedo fitted to perfection, but his gray eyes held all the warmth of surgical steel. Behind him, Dr. Ronald Colton beamed with satisfaction, his chest puffed out like a peacock displaying its plumage. This was his moment of triumph, the day the Colton name would finally be linked to old American aristocracy, even if that aristocracy had fallen on hard times. As Hallie reached the altar, Henry barely glanced at her. Instead, he leaned close enough that only she could hear his voice, cold and clipped. "Let's get this over with." The words hit like a slap. Hallie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin up, focusing on the stained glass windows behind the altar instead of the man who was about to become her husband. This wasn't about love, she reminded herself. This was about saving her mother's life. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Henry Colton and Hallie Thornfield in holy matrimony." Holy. The word felt like mockery. There was nothing holy about this arrangement, nothing sacred about two people being forced together by desperation and ambition. The ceremony proceeded like a beautiful, elaborate charade. Henry's responses were mechanically correct, delivered with the same detached professionalism he probably used when discussing treatment options with patients. When the time came to place the ring on her finger, his touch was brief, impersonal. The contact of a stranger performing a necessary task. "You may kiss the bride." Henry's lips touched hers for exactly as long as social convention required, and not a moment longer. The kiss was as cold and perfunctory as everything else about him. A stamp on a contract, rather than a gesture of love. The congregation erupted in applause, champagne corks popped, and photographers captured what would surely be featured in tomorrow's society pages as the wedding of the season. But all Hallie could think about was her mother, lying in that hospital bed, dependent on machines and treatments that this marriage would provide. As rice rained down on them during their exit, Henry's hand on her elbow was firm but distant, his smile for the cameras practiced and empty. He guided her toward the waiting limousine like he was escorting a business associate, not his new wife. Once inside the privacy of the car, the facade cracked completely. Henry loosened his tie with sharp, irritated movements and stared out the window without speaking. "The reception will be," Hallie began tentatively. 3 hours. Henry cut her off without looking at her. "We make appearances, shake hands, cut the cake, dance once for the photographers. After that, you can do whatever you want. I have surgery at 6 a.m. It's our wedding day." Henry finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes holding a mixture of resentment and something that might have been pity. "No, Miss Thornfield. Mrs. Colton now, I suppose. This is the day my father purchased your family name, and I paid the price for his social climbing. Nothing more, nothing less." The cruelty of his words, delivered in that calm, professional tone, made Hallie's chest tight with humiliation. She turned away, Blinking back tears, she refused to let him see. Outside the limousine windows, Pittsburgh's autumn scenery blurred past, beautiful and indifferent to the tragedy unfolding inside the luxury vehicle. Somewhere in this city, her mother was breathing with the help of machines paid for by this mockery of a marriage. Somewhere else, her father was probably placing bets with money he didn't have, oblivious to the sacrifice his daughter had just made to clean up the mess he'd created. And here, in the back of a limousine that cost more than most people made in a year, Hallie Thornfield Colton sat next to her new husband and understood, with devastating clarity, that she had just traded her freedom for her mother's life. The reception would be elegant, the photographs would be perfect, and tomorrow the society pages would celebrate the union of two of Pittsburgh's most prominent medical families. What they wouldn't capture was the way Henry's touch felt like ice, the way his smile never reached his eyes, or the way Hallie's heart was already beginning to crack under the weight of a loveless marriage that felt more like a life sentence than a new beginning. 3 years earlier. The Thornfield Mansion had once been the crown jewel of Pittsburgh's Shadyside district, its Georgian columns and manicured grounds a testament to 4 generations of pharmaceutical fortune. Hallie remembered running through these halls as a child, her laughter echoing off crystal chandeliers that caught afternoon sunlight like captured rainbows. Now at 21, she stood in what used to be her father's study, watching strangers catalog their possessions for auction. The Waterford Crystal Collection should fetch a decent price, the appraiser muttered, making notes on his clipboard. Though the market for estate pieces has been soft lately. Hallie's mother, Eleanor Thornfield, sat rigidly in a wingback chair that had been in their family for 3 generations, her hands folded in her lap with the composure that had been drilled into her since birth. But Hallie could see the tremor in her fingers, the way her breathing had become shallow and labored over the past months. "Where is he?" Eleanor asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the empty doorway. Hallie didn't need to ask who. Her father, Charles Thornfield, had been stepping out for increasingly longer periods, leaving behind nothing but empty bottles and betting slips as evidence of his presence. "I don't know, Mother." The truth was worse than that. Hallie knew exactly where her father was, at one of his usual haunts, burning through what little remained of their emergency funds while their world collapsed around them. The pharmaceutical company that had supported their family for generations was gone, sold to pay gambling debts. The investments, the trust funds, even her college tuition money, all of it sacrificed to Charles's addictions. "Miss Thornfield?" The appraiser approached with apologetic deference. "We'll need to discuss the timeline for removal. The bank requires the house to be cleared by month's end." Month's end. 4 more days. That evening, as Hallie helped her mother sort through photograph albums, one of the few possessions they'd be allowed to keep, Eleanor collapsed. The heart attack was severe, the doctor at Presbyterian Hospital explained. The stress, the poor nutrition from months of financial strain, the emotional trauma of watching her world crumble, it had all taken its toll on Eleanor's cardiovascular system. "She'll need extensive treatment," Dr. Morrison said gently, his gray hair and kind eyes reminding Hallie of the grandfather she'd lost years earlier. "Surgery, medication, ongoing care. I won't lie to you, Miss Thornfield. This won't be inexpensive." Hallie stared at the estimate he handed her, the numbers swimming before her eyes. Even with insurance, the costs were staggering. More than she could make in 5 years working the part-time jobs that had become necessary since their fortune disappeared. "There has to be some kind of payment plan." Of course, Dr. Morrison assured her. "We'll work something out. No one should have to choose between health and financial ruin." But Hallie had heard the uncertainty in his voice, had seen the way his expression tightened when he looked at her address, a cramped apartment in Oakland, where she and her mother had moved after losing the mansion. The Thornfield name still carried weight in certain circles, but weight without wealth was just another burden. That's when Dr. Ronald Colton appeared, like an angel of mercy dressed in an expensive suit. "Hallie, my dear," he said, approaching her in the hospital corridor with outstretched arms and a warm smile. "I came as soon as I heard about Eleanor." How is she? Ronald had been a friend of the family for years, though Hallie remembered him more as an ambitious colleague of her grandfather's than a close intimate. He'd built Colton Medical Center from nothing, becoming one of the most successful doctors in Pittsburgh, but somehow he'd never quite gained acceptance into the old money circles that had always welcomed the Thornfields. It's serious, Hallie managed, exhaustion making her voice shake. Of course it is. The stress of your family's situation would be enough to break anyone's heart. Literally, it seems. Ronald's expression grew grave, paternal. But you mustn't worry about the medical expenses. Eleanor will receive the finest care available. I'll see to that personally. Dr. Colton, I can't possibly— Nonsense. Your grandfather helped me establish my practice decades ago. This is simply me returning a favor. Ronald placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. There's a private wing at my hospital, the finest cardiac specialists on the East Coast. Eleanor will want for nothing. The cost— we'll work out the details later. Right now, what matters is your mother's health. Hallie felt tears of relief threaten to spill. After months of watching their world crumble, someone was finally offering help without judgment, without the pity she'd grown to hate from their former social circle. What she didn't see was the calculating gleam in Ronald's eyes, the way his gaze lingered on her face with an expression that had nothing to do with paternal concern and everything to do with long-term investment. 3 weeks later, Eleanor was stable but far from recovered. The surgery had been successful, but the ongoing treatment would require months, possibly years. Hallie had moved into a studio apartment even smaller than their previous place, working 3 jobs: tutoring, waitressing, and cleaning offices at night to cover their basic living expenses. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperately grateful when Ronald invited her to lunch at the elegant university club to discuss her mother's ongoing care. You look tired, my dear, Ronald observed as they settled into the club's private dining room, surrounded by oil paintings of Pittsburgh's industrial titans. I'm fine, just concerned about Mother. Of course you are. You're a devoted daughter. It's one of your most admirable qualities. Ronald signaled the waiter for wine, expensive Burgundy that Hallie recognized from dinners at their old house. But I'm concerned about the burden this is placing on you. Working multiple jobs, no time for your own education or future. I can handle it. I'm sure you can. The Thornfield strength has always been legendary. Ronald's smile was warm, almost fatherly. But there might be another way. A solution that would benefit everyone involved. Hallie set down her water glass, suddenly alert to something in Ronald's tone. What kind of solution? Well, it's rather delicate. Ronald paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. You're aware that my son Henry is one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. Brilliant surgeon, impeccable reputation, heir to everything I've built. Yes, I know of Dr. Colton. She'd seen him at various social functions over the years. Tall, handsome, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by the kind of sophisticated women who made modeling their primary occupation. They'd never spoken beyond polite pleasantries. Henry is at an age where he should be thinking about marriage, establishing a family legacy. And while he's certainly popular with a certain type of woman, Ronald's expression suggested distaste. These modern girls, they're interested in glamour, excitement. They don't understand the responsibilities that come with true prominence. I'm not sure I understand. What I'm suggesting, my dear, is a partnership that would solve several problems at once. Ronald leaned forward, his voice dropping to confidential tones. Your mother would receive the finest medical care available, with all expenses covered indefinitely. You would be freed from the burden of multiple jobs, able to focus on your education or whatever pursuits interest you, and Henry would have a wife who understands the weight of family name, the importance of tradition and respectability. The room seemed to tilt around Hallie. You're suggesting marriage? I'm suggesting a union that would honor both our families' legacies. The Thornfields have always represented the finest of American aristocracy, education, refinement, unimpeachable social standing. The Coltons have wealth and influence, but we lack the historical gravitas that your name would provide. Dr. Colton, I barely know your son. Details that can be worked out over time. Henry is a good man, Hallie. Perhaps a bit focused on his career, but that's what makes him such an exceptional surgeon. With the right woman beside him, someone with your breeding and character, he could accomplish anything. Hallie stared at the older man, trying to process what he was suggesting. An arranged marriage, like something from a Victorian novel. The idea was archaic, impossible. And yet, my mother's treatment costs are already substantial, she said slowly. Would be completely eliminated, plus whatever additional care she might need in the future. Ronald's voice grew gentle, persuasive. I know this seems sudden, overwhelming. But sometimes the best solutions are the ones that seem unconventional at first glance. What does Henry think about this proposal? A flicker of something, irritation, concern, passed across Ronald's face before the warm smile returned. Henry trusts my judgment in all matters. He knows I would never suggest anything that wasn't in his best interests. Ronald reached across the table to pat her hand. Take your time to consider it, my dear. There's no pressure. But remember, your mother's health won't wait for perfect circumstances. The implicit threat was delivered so gently, wrapped in such paternal concern, that Hallie almost missed it. Almost. That night, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, watching the machines that kept Eleanor stable, Hallie tried to imagine any other solution. Her jobs barely covered rent and food. The medical bills were mounting daily. Without Ronald's intervention, her mother would be transferred to a state facility where the care would be adequate at best, probably fatal at worst. What are you thinking about, sweetheart? Eleanor asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Hallie looked at her mother's pale face, at the tubes and wires that had become their new normal, and felt her heart break all over again. Nothing important, mother, just planning for the future. But even as she said the words, Hallie knew there was no future to plan. Ronald Colton had made sure of that. He'd trapped her as surely as if he'd locked her in a cage, using her love for her mother as the key. The wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Ronald Colton stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, gazing down at Pittsburgh's Golden Triangle as morning light reflected off the 3 rivers. At 62, he had everything a man could want: a medical empire worth hundreds of millions, a reputation that commanded respect throughout the East Coast, and a son who was following admirably in his footsteps. Everything except the one thing that mattered most: acceptance. The intercom buzzed. Dr. Colton, your appointment with Harrison Webb and Associates is here. Send them in. 3 men in identical Navy suits entered, the kind of lawyers who charged by the minute and were worth every penny. They represented old Pittsburgh money, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Hineses, families whose names had been carved into the city's foundation decades before the Coltons had climbed out of working-class obscurity. Gentlemen, Ronald greeted them with practiced warmth. Thank you for coming. I trust you've reviewed the proposed merger documents? James Harrison, the senior partner whose grandfather had helped establish U.S. Steel, settled into the leather chair across from Ronald's desk with the languid confidence of inherited wealth. We have, Dr. Colton. The financial terms are generous. But my clients have concerns about the cultural fit. Colton Medical Center, while certainly successful, represents a rather different philosophy than the institutions our families have traditionally supported. The polite dismissal landed like a physical blow, though Ronald's expression never wavered. Different how? Well, you cater to a more commercial clientele. Insurance patients, Medicare recipients. Our families have always supported institutions focused on advancing medical research, training the next generation of elite physicians. Prestige rather than profit, you might say. Ronald felt his jaw clench. Commercial clientele, as if saving lives was somehow less noble when the patients couldn't trace their ancestry to the Mayflower. I see. And what would it take to address these philosophical concerns? The three lawyers exchanged glances. Harrison's smile was thin, condescending. Frankly, Dr. Colton, it's not about what you do. It's about who you are. Your family lacks the historical connections, the social standing that our clients require in their associates. Nothing personal, you understand. Simply a matter of maintaining standards. After they left, Ronald sat alone in his office, rage burning in his chest like acid. 40 years of building his practice, of revolutionizing cardiac surgery in Pittsburgh, of saving lives that other doctors had written off as lost causes, and they dismissed him as commercial. Common. The worst part was that they were right about one thing: he did lack the historical connections. His father had been a factory worker, his grandfather an immigrant who'd changed the family name from Coltano to Colton to sound more American. Everything Ronald had achieved, he'd built with his own hands. But it would never be enough. Not for them. That evening, Ronald found himself in the Shadyside district, driving slowly past the Thornfield mansion that was scheduled for demolition next month. The house sat empty now, its windows dark, but he could remember the parties held there in years past. Elegant gatherings where Pittsburgh's old guard would drink champagne and discuss art, literature, politics. He'd attended those parties as a guest of old Dr. Thornfield, Hallie's grandfather, but he'd never truly belonged. He was the brilliant young surgeon, useful for conversation about medical advances, but always slightly apart from the inner circle of families whose wealth stretched back generations. The Thornfields, on the other hand, were American aristocracy. Their ancestor had been a Continental Army officer under Washington, their fortune built on patents for pharmaceutical compounds that had revolutionized medicine in the early 1900s. Even now, broke and fallen, the Thornfield name carried more weight in certain circles than all of Ronald's wealth, which gave him an idea. The plan took shape over several weeks of careful observation and research. Charles Thornfield's gambling debts were even worse than public knowledge suggested. He owed money to some very dangerous people. Eleanor's medical condition was genuinely serious, requiring ongoing care that would bankrupt any normal family. And Hallie was perfect. Beautiful, educated, desperate, and carrying a name that would open every door Ronald had ever found closed to him. The lunch at the university club went exactly as he'd hoped. Hallie was too inexperienced, too overwhelmed by her circumstances to see the trap being laid. She genuinely believed he was offering help out of familial obligation, never suspecting that her desperation was exactly what he'd been counting on. Henry, predictably, had not taken the news well. "You want me to marry a girl I've barely spoken to?" Henry stood in the same office where Ronald had been dismissed by the lawyers, his face flushed with anger. "Have you lost your mind? I want you to marry a Thornfield. There's a significant difference. She's a Thornfield with no money, no connections, no influence. What possible benefit? Her name, Henry, her bloodline, her social standing that predates this entire city." Ronald moved to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "Do you know how many medical boards I've been rejected from? How many private clubs have found my membership applications not quite suitable? How many business opportunities I've lost because I don't have the right ancestry? So you're going to buy your way into the aristocracy by forcing your son to marry a poor girl? I'm going to secure our family's legacy by connecting it to one of America's oldest medical dynasties." Ronald's voice hardened. "Everything I've built, everything you've inherited, means nothing if we can't move in the circles that truly matter. The Thornfield name will change that overnight." Henry ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Ronald recognized from his son's childhood when faced with impossible homework problems. "What about Rebecca? We've been together for 2 years. Rebecca is a model, a beautiful, charming model, with no education, no family connections, and no understanding of what it means to be married to a serious physician." Ronald's dismissal of Henry's girlfriend was swift and brutal. "She's suitable for entertainment, not partnership. I love her. You love the idea of her, the excitement, the glamour, the way she makes you feel like you're starring in some Hollywood romance. Ronald moved closer to his son, his voice growing paternal but implacable. But love fades, Henry. Passion burns out. What lasts is family legacy, social position, the foundation you build for your children and grandchildren. This is insane. This is strategic. Hallie Thornfield is intelligent, well-bred, and desperate enough to be grateful for our generosity. She'll make an excellent wife and an ideal mother for your children. More importantly, she'll give those children something I can't: blue blood that traces back to the founding of this country. Henry stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time. You're talking about a human being like she's a breeding mare. I'm talking about a young woman who needs our help and can provide something valuable in return. It's a business arrangement that benefits everyone involved. What if I refuse? Ronald's expression grew cold, calculating. Then you can explain to your patients why their surgeon is suddenly unavailable. Colton Medical Center has made you one of the youngest department heads in the country, Henry. It can just as easily make you unemployed. The threat hung between them like a blade. Henry had known this moment would come eventually, the day when his father's expectations would collide with his own desires. He'd just never imagined it would be over something as fundamental as choosing his own wife. Give me time to think about it. Time is a luxury we don't have. Eleanor Thornfield's condition is deteriorating, and Hallie's financial situation grows more desperate by the day. The longer we wait, the less grateful she'll be for our intervention. That night, Henry drove to Rebecca's apartment in Lawrenceville, a converted warehouse space that suited her artistic pretensions and bohemian lifestyle. She greeted him at the door wearing one of his old medical school t-shirts and nothing else, her platinum blonde hair tousled from sleep. "Henry, I wasn't expecting you tonight." Rebecca wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her surgically enhanced body against him. "Did you miss me already?" He had missed her enthusiasm, her easy laughter, the way she made everything feel light and uncomplicated. Rebecca Shaw was everything his father disapproved of, which had initially been part of her appeal. "We need to talk," he said, gently extricating himself from her embrace. "That sounds ominous." Rebecca pouted playfully, leading him to the massive leather couch that dominated her living space. "Please tell me you're not going to lecture me about my spending again. That bracelet was an investment in our future. I need to look the part of a successful doctor's wife." Wife. The word felt like a weight in his chest. "Rebecca, my father has some expectations about my future, about who I should marry." Her expression sharpened, the playful mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "What kind of expectations?" "He wants me to marry someone more suitable, someone with the right family background." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying his face with an intensity he'd rarely seen from her. "Someone like Hallie Thornfield?" Henry's surprise must have shown on his face, because Rebecca laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Oh, please, Henry. I may be just a model, but I'm not stupid. Your father's been circling that girl like a shark ever since her family went broke. It's been gossip fodder for months. Will the great Dr. Colton help the fallen Thornfields out of the goodness of his heart?" "How did you know about it?" "Because unlike you, I pay attention to social dynamics. Your father has been trying to buy his way into old money circles for years, and everyone knows it." Rebecca stood up, her movements sharp with anger. "What I don't understand is why you're even considering it. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Either you want to marry me, or you want to marry her. Everything else is just excuses." Henry looked at Rebecca, really looked at her, and tried to imagine introducing her to the medical board, taking her to hospital fundraisers, building a life together that extended beyond expensive restaurants and weekend getaways. The image wouldn't form. "I need some time to think," he said finally. "No, you don't." Rebecca's voice was cold now, professional. "You've already decided. You're just too much of a coward to admit it." She was right, of course. The moment his father had laid out the choice, marry Hallie Thornfield or lose everything he'd worked for, the decision had been made. Henry just hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. 6 weeks later, he stood at the altar of St. Matthew's Cathedral, watching a young woman he barely knew walk toward him in a dress that cost more than most people's cars, and understood with perfect clarity that he'd just traded his freedom for his father's ambitions. The worst part wasn't the loss of Rebecca, or even the forced nature of the arrangement. The worst part was how right his father would be proved to be. The penthouse apartment at 1 Oxford Centre had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. Once when Ronald had it professionally designed, and again after Henry added his own touches following medical school. 37 floors above Pittsburgh, it was a monument to success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views, Italian marble floors, custom furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. It was also, Hallie realized within hours of moving in, the loneliest place she'd ever lived. "Your room is down the hall," Henry said curtly, barely glancing at her single suitcase as they entered the foyer. "The housekeeper comes twice a week. There's a concierge service for anything else you might need." "Henry, I thought we might—" "Dr. Colton," he corrected, his voice sharp. "We're not friends, Mrs. Colton. We're business partners. I'd prefer to keep things professional." The formality was like a slap, but Hallie forced herself to nod. "Of course, Dr. Colton." He disappeared into his study without another word, leaving Hallie alone in the cavernous living room with its abstract art and uncomfortable-looking furniture. Through the massive windows, Pittsburgh spread out below like a glittering circuit board, beautiful and completely unreachable. Her bedroom, their guest room really, was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with her mother. It had its own bathroom, a walk-in closet bigger than most bedrooms, and a view that real estate agents would kill for. It was also clearly temporary, furnished with the kind of impersonal elegance that suggested no one was expected to actually live there. The first few weeks established a routine of mutual avoidance. Henry left for the hospital before dawn and returned after she'd gone to bed. When their paths did cross, brief encounters in the kitchen or hallway, he treated her with the same polite efficiency he probably used with pharmaceutical salespeople. Cordial, professional, utterly devoid of warmth. Hallie threw herself into visiting her mother, spending entire days at the hospital reading aloud from Eleanor's favorite novels, or simply sitting quietly while the machines hummed their mechanical lullabies. The private room Ronald had arranged was like a luxury hotel suite compared to the public wards, with fresh flowers, comfortable furniture, and nurses who had time to chat rather than rushing between overcrowded rooms. "You look thin, sweetheart," Eleanor observed during one visit, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Are you eating properly?" "I'm fine, Mother. The treatment is working. You're looking so much better." "Thanks to your sacrifice." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "My darling girl, what have I allowed you to do?" "You didn't allow anything. I chose this." It was a lie they both pretended to believe. The first real crisis came 3 weeks into the marriage, when Hallie answered Henry's phone during one of his marathon shifts at the hospital. "Henry? Thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you all day." The voice was female, breathless, with the kind of professional polish that came from years of modeling. Hallie felt her stomach clench even before the woman continued. "I know you said you needed space, but I can't stop thinking about what we talked about us. I think I was hasty, saying those things about your father's expectations. If you want to make this work, really work, I'm willing to—" "I'm sorry," Hallie interrupted gently. "This isn't Henry. This is Mrs. Colton." The silence that followed was deafening. "Mrs. Colton," the woman repeated slowly. "I see. And would Mrs. Colton be so kind as to tell my fiancé that Rebecca called?" "Your fiancé? Oh, didn't he tell you? We've been engaged for 6 months. Unofficially, of course. Henry wanted to wait until after his father's hospital expansion was finalized before making any announcements. But I suppose those plans have changed. Rebecca's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. Perhaps you could let him know that I still have the ring he gave me, in case he wants it back for future use. The line went dead, leaving Hallie staring at the phone with trembling hands. Henry had been engaged to someone else while negotiating his marriage to her. When Henry returned home that evening, Hallie was waiting in the living room, the cordless phone on the coffee table between them like evidence at a trial. "Rebecca called," she said without preamble. Henry's face went carefully blank. What did she want? To speak to her fiancé. Former fiancé. She seemed to think it was news to me that you'd been engaged. Hallie's voice was steady despite the anger building in her chest. Were you planning to mention that at some point? Henry moved to the bar cart, pouring himself 2 fingers of whiskey with movements that were too controlled to be casual. My previous relationship isn't relevant to our arrangement. Your engagement isn't relevant? My former engagement, Henry corrected, downing half the whiskey in one swallow. And no, it's not relevant. Rebecca and I ended things before our wedding. How long before? The timing doesn't matter. How long? Henry's gray eyes flashed with something between guilt and defiance. 2 days. The admission hung between them like a lit fuse. 2 days. He'd been engaged to another woman 2 days before marrying her. I see. Hallie stood up, smoothing her skirt with hands that shook only slightly. Well, thank you for clarifying the timeline. It certainly puts our wedding day into perspective. Hallie. Mrs. Colton, she corrected, throwing his own formality back at him. If we're keeping things professional. She made it to her bedroom before the tears came, great gasping sobs that she muffled against her pillow. Not because she'd harbored any illusions about love. She'd known from the beginning this was a business arrangement. But because the casual cruelty of it, the complete disregard for her feelings or dignity, made her feel smaller than she'd thought possible. The next morning, Henry was gone before she woke up, but he'd left coffee in the pot and a note on the counter. I'm sorry. The situation with Rebecca was complicated, but that's no excuse for not being honest with you. It was the first personal communication he'd initiated since their wedding day, and it left Hallie feeling even more confused than angry. Was this an apology, or just damage control? The question was answered the following week when she came home from the hospital to find Rebecca Shaw sitting in her living room. She was everything Hallie had imagined and worse, tall, platinum blonde, with the kind of surgically perfected beauty that graced magazine covers. Her dress probably cost more than Hallie's entire wardrobe, and she wore it with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own desirability. Mrs. Colton, I presume? Rebecca stood with predatory grace, her smile sharp enough to cut. I hope you don't mind. The concierge let me up. I told him I was family. What do you want? To see the woman who stole my fiancé. I didn't steal anything. Henry ended your relationship before our marriage. 2 days before, Rebecca laughed, moving closer with the confidence of a woman accustomed to intimidating her competition. Barely enough time for the engagement ring to cool before he was slipping a wedding band on your finger. She held up her left hand, where a massive diamond solitaire caught the afternoon light like captured fire. He gave this to me at Per Se in New York. 3 carats, flawless cut, cost him $40,000. Tell me, what did he give you for your engagement? Hallie's chest tightened. There had been no engagement, no romantic proposal, no ring chosen with love. Just a business meeting disguised as lunch, and a contract masquerading as a marriage certificate. I thought so. Rebecca's smile grew sharper. No ring, no proposal, no romance whatsoever. Just a desperate girl and a man doing his father's bidding. Why are you here? to make you an offer." Rebecca settled back onto the white leather couch as if she owned it. "Henry's infatuation with playing the dutiful son won't last forever. He's a passionate man. Surely you've noticed. All that intensity he brings to surgery doesn't just disappear in his personal life." Heat flooded Hallie's cheeks. The truth was, she had no idea what Henry was like as a passionate man. Their interactions had been so coldly professional, she sometimes wondered if he was capable of genuine emotion at all. "When he comes back to me, and he will come back to me, it would be so much tidier if you simply stepped aside gracefully. No messy divorce proceedings, no ugly publicity, just a quiet annulment and a generous settlement that would take care of your mother's medical bills permanently. Henry won't come back to you. Won't he?" Rebecca's laugh was musical, confident. "Darling, you're living in his guest room, eating dinner alone every night, married to a man who treats you like an unwelcome houseguest. Do you really think that's sustainable?" She stood, smoothing her dress with practiced elegance. "I'll be patient for a while. Henry needs to work this rebellion out of his system, but eventually he'll remember what real passion feels like, and when he does, I'll be waiting." After Rebecca left, Hallie sat alone in the too-perfect living room, staring out at the city lights that seemed to mock her with their distant beauty. Every word Rebecca had spoken was true. She was living like a stranger in her own supposed home, married to a man who barely acknowledged her existence, sustained only by the knowledge that her sacrifice was keeping her mother alive. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift in the careful choreography of avoidance she and Henry had established. It started small, coming home to find that he'd ordered dinner for two instead of his usual solitary meal, left with a note saying he'd been called back to the hospital. Conversation that lasted more than 30 seconds when their paths crossed in the kitchen. His medical journals left open on topics related to her mother's condition, as if he'd been researching Eleanor's case in his spare time. "Your mother's recovery is progressing remarkably well," he commented one evening, finding Hallie reading in the living room when he returned from surgery. "Thanks to your father's generosity," Hallie replied carefully. "The specialists he arranged have been wonderful." "My father's generosity." Henry's tone was flat, unreadable. "Is that what you call it?" Something in his voice made Hallie look up from her book. Henry stood in the doorway, still wearing surgical scrubs, his dark hair disheveled, exhaustion clear in every line of his body. But his eyes held something she hadn't seen before, doubt maybe, or guilt. "What would you call it?" Henry was quiet for a long moment, then moved to the bar cart, pouring himself his usual whiskey. "Investment." "In what?" "In you. In your name. In the social connections that marriage to you provides." He took a sip, watching her reaction carefully. "You really don't see it, do you? What this marriage gives him. It gives him the satisfaction of helping an old family friend. It gives him entree into circles that have been closed to him his entire career. Medical boards, hospital fundraising committees, private clubs that base membership on bloodline rather than bank balance." Henry's voice grew bitter. "The Thornfield name is worth more to him than everything I've accomplished as a surgeon." The words hit like physical blows. "That's not. He wouldn't use my family's reputation for personal gain." "Wouldn't he? Have you looked at the guest list for the hospital's annual fundraising gala next month? Notice any names that weren't there in previous years?" Hallie hadn't seen any guest list, hadn't even known there was a gala. The realization must have shown on her face because Henry's expression softened slightly. "He didn't tell you about it?" "No." "You're expected to attend, as my wife, as a Thornfield." Henry finished his whiskey in one swallow. "Half of Pittsburgh's old money families will be there, people who've been politely declining his invitations for years. But they'll come now to meet the woman who connects the Colton fortune to American aristocracy." "I don't understand why you're telling me this." Henry set down his glass, studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. Because I think you deserve to know what you've gotten yourself into. What we've both gotten ourselves into. And what is that? A performance that neither of us auditioned for. For the first time since their wedding day, Henry's mask of professional indifference slipped completely. What she saw underneath was raw, complicated, anger and guilt, and something that might have been sympathy. I should let you get back to your reading, he said, but he made no move to leave. Henry? Yes? Do you ever regret it? The choice you made? He was quiet for so long that Hallie thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Every day. The admission hung between them like a bridge, fragile, tentative, but real. For the first time since their forced wedding, Hallie saw not Dr. Henry Colton, the cold professional who treated her like an unwelcome obligation, but simply Henry, a man as trapped by circumstances as she was. Me too, she said softly. And in the silence that followed, something began to shift between them. Not love. It was far too soon for anything that complicated. But understanding, perhaps. Recognition that they were both casualties of the same manipulation, both struggling to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The annual hospital gala at the Omni William Penn was everything Hallie had expected, opulent, suffocating, and designed to showcase Ronald's social triumph. She moved through the evening like an actress playing a role, smiling on cue, making appropriate small talk, allowing Henry's hand to rest possessively on her waist while he charmed donors and board members. They were the perfect couple, she reflected bitterly. Beautiful, well-bred, completely miserable. Darling, I need to take this call, Henry murmured during the cocktail hour, his phone buzzing insistently in his jacket pocket. It's the hospital. Emergency. Hallie nodded, watching him step onto the hotel's garden terrace for privacy. She'd grown accustomed to these interruptions, these sudden calls that pulled him away from whatever social obligation they were enduring together. What she hadn't grown accustomed to was the way he'd left his phone on the table when he'd pulled out his wallet to tip the valet earlier. The screen lit up with another message, and Hallie glanced at it reflexively, expecting to see something medical-related. Instead, she saw, "Missing you tonight. Wish I could be your date instead of playing pretend with her. RRX." Her breath caught. Then another message appeared. "Tuesday was incredible. Same time Thursday? My place? X Tuesday." Hallie's mind raced back. Tuesday night, when Henry had returned home at nearly midnight, claiming emergency surgery. Wednesday morning, when she'd noticed he smelled different, not like antiseptic and hospital soap, but like expensive perfume. With trembling fingers, she scrolled up through the message thread. Weeks of texts, spanning their entire marriage. Plans for meetings, intimate messages, photographs she couldn't bring herself to examine too closely. "Sorry about that." Henry's voice behind her made her jump. "Just a consult about tomorrow's." He stopped mid-sentence, seeing his phone in her hands, seeing the expression on her face. "Hallie, emergency surgery?" Her voice was deadly quiet. "Is that what you call it?" Henry's face went pale. Around them, the gala continued. Laughter, conversation, the clink of champagne glasses. But Hallie felt like they were surrounded by a bubble of perfect, devastating silence. "We should go home," Henry said quietly. The ride back to the penthouse passed in suffocating silence. Henry stared out the window while Hallie clutched her evening bag, the evidence of his betrayal burning in her mind like acid. Not betrayal, she corrected herself. Betrayal implied they'd had something to betray. This was simply the confirmation of what she'd always known. She meant nothing to him. Less than nothing. The moment their apartment door closed behind them, the careful composure Hallie had maintained all evening finally cracked. 3 months, she said, her voice shaking with rage. 3 months we've been married, and you never stopped seeing her. Not for a single day. Hallie, let me explain. Explain what? How you've been lying to me every night you came home late? How you've been sleeping with another woman while I played the dutiful wife for your father's cameras." Henry loosened his bow tie with sharp, agitated movements. "Our marriage isn't real. You said so yourself. It's a business arrangement. A business arrangement that includes fidelity clauses. Did you think I wouldn't care? Did you think I was so pathetic, so grateful for your family's charity, that I'd just accept being humiliated? You're not being humiliated. I'm your wife." The words exploded out of her. "Whatever the circumstances, whatever the reasons, I'm legally, publicly, socially your wife, and you're making me look like a fool." Henry's composure finally cracked. "What did you expect from me? Love? Romance? Some fairy tale ending where we fall into each other's arms and live happily ever after? I expected basic respect. I expected you to honor the commitment you made, even if you didn't want to make it." Hallie's voice broke with months of suppressed pain. "I gave up everything for this marriage, Henry. My freedom, my future, my chance at finding someone who could actually love me. And you can't even give me the dignity of fidelity. I never asked you to sacrifice anything. Yes, you did. Every time you treated me like a stranger in our own home, every time you made me feel like an unwelcome guest, every time you reminded me that this marriage was just an inconvenience you had to endure, you were asking me to sacrifice my self-worth for your comfort." Henry stared at her, something like shock replacing the anger on his face. "Hallie, and the worst part is, I've been making excuses for you, telling myself you were just as trapped as I was, that you were struggling with an impossible situation. But you weren't struggling. You were having your cake and eating it too. The social benefits of marriage to me, and the emotional satisfaction of your real relationship with her. It's not like that. It's exactly like that." Tears were streaming down Hallie's face now. "You're a coward, Henry. Too weak to stand up to your father. Too selfish to honor your commitments. Too cruel to even pretend to care about the woman you forced into this nightmare with you. Forced? You agreed to this marriage to save my mother's life. While you agreed to it for social advancement and the freedom to keep screwing your girlfriend on the side." The words hung between them like a blade. Henry's face went white, then flushed with anger. "At least I'm honest about what I want. At least I'm not pretending this mockery of a marriage could ever be anything real. Get out." "What? Get out!" Hallie screamed, her composure completely shattered. "Go to her. Go to your precious Rebecca who actually wants you, who you actually want. Stop pretending you're trapped here with me when you've been running to her every chance you get." Henry grabbed his keys from the counter, his movements sharp with fury. "Fine. At least with her, I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not." "What's that?" "A husband who gives a damn about his wife." The cruelty of it took Hallie's breath away. Henry stared at her for a moment, his gray eyes holding a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret, then turned and walked out. The apartment door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving Hallie alone with the wreckage of their marriage and the terrible knowledge that everything she'd sacrificed had been for nothing. Outside, the sound of Henry's car engine roared to life, then faded into the distance as he drove away into the night. But Henry's mind was spinning with Hallie's words, with the pain he'd seen in her eyes, with the devastating realization that everything she'd said was true. He was a coward. He had been using both women, Hallie for social advancement, Rebecca for emotional satisfaction, without considering the cost to either of them. The guilt and rage at himself made his hands shake on the steering wheel. He pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to escape the truth of what he'd become. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50, 60 miles per hour through city streets that demanded half that speed. He almost didn't see the red light at Fifth Avenue. The semi-truck was already halfway through the intersection when Henry's BMW slammed into its side. The impact sent his car spinning like a child's toy, metal screaming against asphalt, glass exploding in a shower of deadly fragments. In the seconds before unconsciousness claimed him, Henry's last coherent thought was of Hallie's face. Not angry, not accusatory, but heartbroken. He'd broken something precious, something he'd never even realized he wanted, until it was too late. The sound of sirens filled the night air, emergency vehicles racing toward the twisted wreckage at the intersection where Dr. Henry Colton's old life had ended, and where, if he survived, something entirely new would have to begin. 3 months had passed since the accident. The penthouse no longer felt like Henry Colton's fortress of marble and silence. Luxury still clung to every surface. Polished wood, high ceilings, panoramic windows. But something had changed. The space carried warmth now. Blankets folded carelessly on the arm of the sofa, pillows that bore the imprint of use, the faint scent of chamomile tea lingering in the air. And in the living room, where art once dominated the walls, stood the hospital bed that had quietly rewritten both their lives. Hallie moved through the space with a quiet grace that wasn't just duty, it was devotion disguised as routine. In her hands, she carried a tray of chicken soup, steam curling upward, the smell filling the air like comfort itself. She stopped by his wheelchair near the window, sunlight painting his features in muted gold. "Lunch," she said softly, her voice carrying both command and care. Henry's jaw tightened. "I can feed myself." "I know." She pulled the chair closer to his side. Her smile was patient, teasing even. "But humor me today." Their eyes met. For the first time, he didn't resist. She lifted the spoon to his lips. He accepted it, slowly. Their fingers brushed as she steadied the bowl, and for the briefest second, neither of them pulled away. "You've gotten better at this," he murmured after a few spoonfuls, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. "At nursing you?" she asked, feigning lightness. "No, at being near me." Without flinching, Hallie's smile faltered. "Well, you haven't bitten my head off in 2 weeks. That helps." His laugh startled them both. A real laugh. It tugged something loose in her chest. Silence stretched, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "Do you think I was born this bitter?" Her brows knit together. "No. I think someone, or something, taught you to be that way." The spoon stilled in her hand. His eyes flickered, shadows moving across them. "My mother died when I was 8, he said, voice rough as gravel. "Ovarian cancer. By the time they caught it, it was everywhere. 2 years of hospitals, needles, chemo, watching her slip away while I pretended not to be terrified." Hallie's throat tightened. She didn't move, afraid to break the fragile honesty spilling out of him. "My father buried himself in work, couldn't stand the sight of weakness, so I learned how to read morphine doses before I learned fractions, learned how to be the man of the house when I was still a boy." He let out a bitter laugh. "And when she was gone, I swore I'd never let anyone matter that much again." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes unguarded. Rebecca was perfect for that. Beautiful, shallow, safe. "I never let her close enough to hurt me." Hallie swallowed. "And me? You terrified me." His voice was raw. "Because you saw straight through everything I built. You weren't impressed. You didn't bow. And the more you pushed back, the more I—" His words faltered, and he let out a shaky breath. "The more I wanted you to matter." Her heart gave a painful twist. She reached across and took his hand. Warm, trembling. "You were broken, Henry. But you're not beyond repair." His head bowed, shoulders heavy. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Maybe not," she whispered, "but you have it anyway. That's what grace is." The sudden ring of the doorbell made them both jump. Hallie set down the tray and went to answer it. Moments later, she returned, cradling a bouquet of white tulips wrapped in brown paper. The scent filled the room, sharp and sweet. "There's no name," she said, her voice catching. Henry cleared his throat. "They're from me." She looked up, eyes wide. "You sent these?" He shifted uncomfortably, almost boyish in his awkwardness. I thought it was time I said thank you. Properly. Tucked into the flowers was a card, his handwriting sharp but careful. For the woman who stayed when she didn't have to, who saw me when I couldn't see myself. This is only the beginning. H. Hallie's breath hitched. She crossed the room slowly, sat on the edge of his bed, and leaned down to press a kiss against his forehead. Her lips lingered there a moment longer than necessary. "That meant more than you know," she whispered. Henry's smile was faint, tired, but sincere. "Then maybe I'm finally learning." That evening, they ended up side by side on the couch. The hospital bed had been pushed to the corner for the night, and a forgotten movie flickered on the screen. Hallie was telling a story about her first job at a diner and how she once dumped a full glass of soda on a politician's lap. She gestured with her hands, laughter spilling from her lips like music. Henry laughed with her, and then he stopped. Just stopped. Because she was radiant in that moment, unguarded, free, alive. And for the first time in years, he didn't see her as his wife by arrangement, or the woman tethered to his broken body. He saw her as the woman who was quietly stealing his heart. He didn't say it yet, but something in him shifted. He was falling. And for once, he wanted to. Hallie thought the apartment was quiet when she slipped into her room. She left the door half closed, kicked off her flats, and began unbuttoning her blouse, relieved to be out of the clothes she'd worn all day. The city lights spilled through the tall window, spilling across her back in silver and gold. Henry wasn't supposed to be there. He had woken restless, his body aching from hours in bed, and wheeled himself toward the kitchen for water. Passing her door, he hadn't meant to glance, but he did. And for a single heartbeat, the world froze. Her back, pale in the soft light, hair cascading down like dark silk, the delicate curve of her waist as she reached for a sweater. It was only a second before she turned and saw him. But that second branded itself into him like fire. Hallie gasped, clutching the blouse to her chest, her cheeks flooding with color. "Henry!" He looked stricken, caught between shame and awe. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." His words stumbled. "I wasn't—" She pulled on the sweater quickly, her hands trembling. "It's fine," she said, her voice unsteady but not angry. "Just forget it." But neither of them forgot. That night, Henry lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He turned onto his side, then back again. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, the image came back. The glow of the window, the way her skin caught the light, the startled look in her eyes when she turned. It wasn't lust alone. It was recognition. For months, Hallie had been beside him, feeding him, helping him walk, laughing at his sarcasm. But tonight he had seen her differently. Not as the dutiful caretaker. Not as the woman bound to him by an arrangement neither of them had chosen. As a woman. And for the first time in years, Henry Colton felt desire so sharp it kept him wide awake. He exhaled, pressing the heel of his hand to his eyes, frustrated with himself. What the hell is happening to me? Minutes dragged into hours. By the time the clock read 1:47 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep. He pushed himself upright, grabbed his cane, and slowly made his way toward the kitchen. Hallie was already there. She stood barefoot on the tile, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing an oversized sweater that fell almost to her knees. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, and she rubbed her arms against the chill. Henry's steps were uneven, but she heard him immediately. She turned, startled, her cheeks pink, not just from the warmth of the stove. "You're up?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, leaning lightly on his cane. His voice was rough from silence, but there was something else in it too. "Mind if I join you?" She hesitated only a second. "Of course." They sat on the couch with steaming mugs of tea, the city lights twinkling beyond the glass. At first they drank in silence, the kind of silence that hummed, heavy with words neither dared to speak. Finally, Henry set his mug down, his hand lingering on the porcelain as if steadying himself. "Hallie, I need to tell you something, about earlier." Her heart skipped. She gripped her cup tighter. "Henry, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He leaned forward, his gray eyes locked on hers. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I swear I wasn't watching, but when I saw you—" His jaw clenched. He broke off, exhaling hard. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." The words hung between them, heavy and bare. Hallie's throat went dry. "I don't want you to think I'm some pervert," Henry went on quickly, his voice urgent. "It wasn't like that. It's just, for the first time since we married, I really saw you. Not the woman stuck in this arrangement. Not the caretaker. You, a woman. And it—" He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "It did something to me I didn't expect." Her pulse hammered in her ears. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to apologize. Because I liked it." His head snapped up. She swallowed, forcing the words out. "It was the first time I felt like you were looking at me as a woman, not as someone you were stuck with." Henry's breath caught, sharp and uneven. Slowly he reached out, his fingers brushing the line of her jaw. Her skin tingled under his touch. She didn't pull away. His hand cupped her face, thumb grazing her cheekbone. He leaned closer, eyes burning into hers. "Not even in my wildest dreams," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "did I imagine I'd feel this much desire for you." Hallie's breath faltered. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Henry's thumb slid gently across her lower lip, lingering. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, each inhale catching as though her body was answering him before her voice could. Then, slowly, he leaned in. His lips brushed hers, tentative, searching, an almost kiss that turned into something real, warm and unsteady. When he pulled back, Hallie blinked at him, dazed, her fingers lifting unconsciously to her mouth. She began. But before she could finish, she closed the distance herself, her lips pressing to his in a sudden, breathless urgency. The kiss deepened instantly. No hesitation this time. Her hands slid to his shoulders, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist, pulling her against him. Months of silence and restraint shattered in that moment. The tea cooled on the table, forgotten. The city outside kept shining. But for Henry and Hallie, time had narrowed to this. The taste of each other, the warmth of skin against skin, the dizzying realization that after everything, they had finally crossed a line neither of them wanted to step back from. The kiss deepened until neither of them remembered who had moved first. Hallie clung to him, fingers tangled in his shirt, as though afraid that if she let go, he might vanish. Henry's hand slid to her waist, hesitant at first, then firmer when he felt her press closer. For months, they had orbited each other in silence, bound by duty, resentment, and unspoken longing. Now the dam had burst. When their lips finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. "Hallie," Henry whispered, his voice rough, almost pleading. "If I keep going, I won't stop." Her chest rose sharply, her pulse racing so fast she could barely hear her own thoughts. She lifted her eyes to his. "Then don't." That was all it took. Henry kissed her again, deeper, slower, tasting every second as if he'd been starving without knowing it. Hallie melted against him, surrendering not out of duty, but desire. When he guided her gently toward his room, she followed without hesitation, her hand locked in his. They didn't rush. Henry's movements were careful, reverent, as though he was afraid she might shatter. He traced her face with his fingertips, brushed strands of hair behind her ear, kissed her like she was something he'd only just discovered existed. And Hallie. Hallie felt alive in a way she never had before. She had loved once, long ago, but her life had been swallowed by responsibility and grief. She had never known what it was to be cherished, to be looked at as though she was the only thing that mattered. That night, in Henry's arms, she finally understood. Morning came quietly. Hallie stirred, the faint light of dawn creeping through the curtains. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she felt it. Henry's arm draped across her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing against her hair, the warmth of his chest beneath her cheek. Her eyes widened. Did that really happen? She turned slightly and found him already awake, watching her. His hand rose, brushing a thumb over her cheek with a tenderness that stole her breath. "This was real?" she whispered. Her voice cracked, betraying the storm inside her. "I actually gave myself to Henry Colton?" His lips curved into a faint, almost disbelieving smile. "Yes, and it was the most real thing I've ever known." She laughed softly, nervous, almost giddy. "Rebecca would never believe you." His eyes darkened, but not with anger, with devotion. "Forget Rebecca. Forget the past. Hallie, last night wasn't just passion. With you, it was love." Her heart stuttered. She searched his face, half afraid he was playing with her, that this was another performance. But there was no armor left in his expression, no arrogance, no cruelty, just Henry, open, vulnerable, utterly hers. "Love?" she repeated, almost breathless. "Love," he confirmed. "For the first time in my life, I don't feel empty. You filled every part of me I didn't even know was hollow." Her laughter bubbled again, soft and disbelieving, but her eyes shimmered with tears. "You're serious. Dead serious," he whispered, leaning in to kiss her nose, then her lips, then the corner of her smile. And as she laughed into his kiss, Henry thought it was the most intoxicating sound he'd ever heard. That morning marked the shift they would never come back from. The couple who had once passed each other in cold silence through the hallways of a luxury apartment were suddenly everywhere together, sharing meals, teasing in the kitchen, touching hands whenever they crossed. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but for the first time, it was real. And Hallie Thornfield, who had once only known duty and sacrifice, woke up knowing what it felt like to be loved. Not for appearances, not for obligation, but for herself. And Henry Colton, who had built walls so high no one dared to climb them, finally let someone in. 3 months later, the sun was barely rising when Henry stirred awake. He reached across the bed instinctively, searching for Hallie's warmth, but found the sheets empty. Frowning, he pushed himself upright and listened. That's when he heard it. The faint sound of retching from the bathroom. His chest tightened, and in seconds he was on his feet, cane forgotten as he made his way across the room. He found Hallie crouched by the sink, rinsing her mouth, her oversized sweater hanging loosely over her knees. "Sweetheart," Henry said softly, concern etched across his face. "Are you all right?" Hallie straightened, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, I don't think that pizza sat well last night." Henry tilted his head, studying her carefully. His instincts were already clicking into place. Let me ask you something." His eyes narrowed slightly, but his lips twitched with the start of a smile. "How long has it been since your last period?" Hallie blinked, thrown by the question. Maybe 3 months?" She shrugged awkwardly. "But that's not unusual. My cycle's always been irregular, especially with stress. You know that." Henry's expression shifted instantly, from concern to dawning realization. Then a grin spread across his face, wide and unrestrained. "Irregular for 3 months?" He let out a short laugh, the kind that came straight from his chest. Hallie frowned, confused. "Why are you smiling like that?" He leaned down, kissed her temple quickly and said, "Wait here." Before she could question him, he was already out the door. 15 minutes later, Henry returned, slightly out of breath, holding a small bag from the pharmacy. He pulled out a pregnancy test and placed it on the counter with the pride of someone delivering a trophy. "Henry!" Hallie's eyes went wide. "Are you serious? We can't just—" "We can. We should." He was practically beaming. "Come on, sweetheart, let's find out." Her hands trembled as she took the test, disappearing into the bathroom stall. Henry paced outside like an expectant father already, running his hands through his hair, muttering under his breath. "Please. Please." When Hallie finally emerged, she was pale, clutching the little stick like it was a bomb. "I can't look," she whispered, shoving it into his hands. Henry glanced down, and the world seemed to still. Then his face broke into pure joy. His eyes filled with tears as he looked up at her. "Hallie, we're having a baby," she gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "No, really? Oh my God." Her knees wobbled, 1,000 emotions crashing over her at once. Fear, disbelief, and underneath it all, an almost uncontrollable happiness. Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as tears slid down his cheeks. He kissed the top of her head, his voice shaking with emotion. "I never thought I'd get this. Not after everything. But you—" He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "You gave me more than a second chance at life. You gave me a future." Hallie was still trembling, half laughing, half crying. "Henry, I don't know if I'm ready." "You don't have to be," he said firmly, brushing his thumbs over her wet cheeks. "We'll be ready together. You and me. Always." She stared at him, the raw sincerity in his gaze anchoring her fears. And for the first time, she let the happiness take over, smiling through her tears. Henry kissed her then, slow, lingering, the kiss of a man who knew his life had just changed forever. And as they held each other in their bathroom, clutching the tiny test between them, both understood the truth. Their love story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the worst circumstances, proving that authentic connection can grow from the most unlikely soil. When two people are forced together by duty and desperation, they might discover that choosing to love each other is the most powerful act of rebellion possible. What did you think of Hallie and Henry's transformation from reluctant spouses to devoted partners? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love, resilience, and the power of choosing each other every day.